Good afternoon, everybody. It is 3 o'clock, the time for our community meeting. We are the Raleigh Organizing Against Racism, and we usually call ourselves ROAR. And I really welcome to this panel discussion today on the bridging the African American and Asian American community for a more equitable future. I'm really excited about this panel discussion, and I have a kind of a personal take on this because I am an Asian American. And also, so this was inspired by a couple of things. One is the recent attack on Asian American community. In fact, that kind of unveiled the ongoing attacks against Asian Americans in this country, particularly during the pandemic, but also stems from a long time ago. And the other thing was when I was a co-presenter on the Asian American and racism back in September, there was an important question raised in the chat that we didn't address, which was, why are we talking about this? And to me, that was a very important question. And oftentimes we meaning Asian American communities, don't know how to advocate our needs, but also are not sure how to work with other communities of color. And there are certainly some feelings of not really connecting with each other, particularly with Asian African American communities. I do go to an HBCU right now, and oftentimes people didn't know much about Asian American history or what Asian American people like. So I'm so excited to be able to bring this panel together. And I'm going to pass it to Siobhan.
Thank you so much, Yuri, and welcome everyone to our community meeting. As you can see displayed on the screen, the mission of Raleigh Organizing Against Racism is to dismantle systems of racial advantage and oppression through education, analysis, healing, community building, and institutional transformation. So we thank you today for being here as we continue in this work and in our organizational mission. Today's community meeting will be held, as all community meetings, in a webinar format. During the webinar format, participants are muted, but you do have a voice, and we'll talk a little bit about that. You will be able to use the chat box to submit questions to moderators, and you can use the chat box to ask any logistical questions as well. And we know that many of you, when you registered via the RSVP, you did submit some questions that you would like to have addressed today, and we'll try to honor that as we speak with our panelists or have them present to us today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Yuri to introduce our guest panelists.
So we have 4 panelists today. Reggie Edwards, she is the founder of the Encouraging Place. And then Jessica Lynn, she's part of the Raleigh Police Accountability Group called Raleigh Pact. And then she also organizes a couple book clubs, which I hope she will talk about. And Ricky Leung from, I may have mispronounced your name, I'm sorry, Ricky. He is a co-founder of North Carolina Asian Americans Together. And Carl Kenny, who is a long-time Durham activist, and he is spiritual leader of Liberation Station. We will be starting with Reggie.
Oh, hello, and thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, what I do is bring people together to talk through race issues. So I was delighted that you all decided to host this forum today because it's so very, very needful. And we need to be talking to each other instead of talking about each other to each other. So I am so grateful that you did that because it's right on time. And if I can share a little tap, I think we cannot we can no longer stay on our separate corners and think we're going to get anywhere with this that's happening in America right now. So if people who are Asian American, if I can say that, we're not going to get through this without doing it together. So it doesn't matter what your education is, or your income, or how many businesses you own, or even how much you assimilate. This particular thing we're going through right now, we've got to do it together because it is all about us. So are there barriers? There are many. There are many barriers, but I don't think a barrier is only there because nobody's pushed it down. And I think that that's something that we can do. But I mean, the truth of the matter is I never even looked at Asian American history until you invited me to be on this panel. And there's so much I learned that I did not even know. So I think that's probably the case with a lot of people. But if we don't get to know each other, if we don't get to share our stories, then we'll be left to ourselves, our own narratives, our own prejudices, and whatever we don't know, we'll make it up. So I just think we're at that place now where Asian Americans are experiencing stuff. And if you look at our history, we've been experiencing stuff, all kind of atrocities, all kind of evil, hateful things. So this is the time for us to close ranks and say, hey, there's something we've got to do together because we're not the enemy and we know who is. And that is, I mean, you know, it ain't no getting around it. It's racism as well as, why am I losing my word right here? Nationalism and white supremacy. That's what I was looking for. So anyway, you can come back to me because I'll give somebody else time because I can go on to tomorrow. But anyway, go on to the next.
Thank you, Reggie. And before I move to the next speaker, I'd like to address a question. There was a question raised. Why are we still being restricted from a full chat box? Does ROAR ever stop the modern day slavery? I am not sure exactly what the modern day slavery, maybe that means the control. And the reason for that is we want people to focus on the speakers. And when there are many chats happening, we may not be able to lift up questions in a timely manner. So please do, thanks for raising that question. And please do continue sending questions for us as a ROAR, as well as to the speakers. Thank you. So the next speaker, I believe, is Jessica Lin.
Thanks, Yuri. All right, I'm going to go ahead and try sharing my screen. Just have a couple of slides. All right, let's see. Okay, I'll go ahead and make this full screen.
Jessica, if you can speak up just a little bit.
Okay, sure. Is this a little bit better?
Yes.
Thank you. Is everyone able to see the slides?
Yes.
Excellent. So hi, everyone. My name is Jessica Lin. I actually grew up in Raleigh. I've been here since 1996 or so and went to Leesville Middle School, Ligon, and Low High School, and went to UNC Chapel Hill for undergrad. Moved to Greensboro for a couple years and then recently moved back to the Triangle about in 2015. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about my involvement in two groups. The first one is with Raleigh PACT, the Police Accountability Community Task Force, and then also some of the book clubs, well, one in particular that I did start on Meetup, where we specifically read authors of color. So just a little bit about Raleigh PACT. It was a group created in 2015. I was not involved at that time. I kind of came on a couple years later. And the group really works to hold the Raleigh Police Department accountable for their actions. Our executive director is Rolanda Bird, and that was actually how I became more involved with Raleigh PACT. Rolanda and I think Barbara also came to an event that was held at the church I was attending previously, UUFR, And Rolanda just spoke very passionately and very movingly about her son being murdered by the Raleigh police. And so this was just, that story just really struck home with me, and that's how I became involved with Raleigh Pact. Folks from that organization held a little discussion afterwards at the church, which I attended, and they invited folks over to the next general body meeting. So I went to a general body meeting and just kind of kept coming back. It really felt like this, you know, the room where folks were involved, people from lots of different groups and organizations, all brought their energy, brought their stories and experiences of negative and terrible interactions with Raleigh PD to the space. And it just really felt like a lot of democracy in action, really people talking about, you know, what are things we can do locally to make change, people going to city council and showing up again and again, year after year, to talk to city council, talk to the mayor, and really just make their voices heard. So this just felt like such a vibrant group to be a part of. Raleigh Pact, we hold a lot of community events, obviously now more virtual during COVID, but beforehand we would canvass different neighborhoods and talk to folks and hold Know Your Rights campaigns, and also kind of did some collaboration with other groups, including NCAT, on candidate forums a few years ago as well. And it was always kind of interesting to me because I think we saw a lot of both Black folks and white folks at a lot of Raleigh Pact general body meetings. But oftentimes I felt like maybe I was only the only Asian American person there. And so just kind of interesting seeing some of the differences, I think. And then also just wanted to talk briefly about my Authors of Color book club that I started on Meetup. So it's a public meetup space. And I created this in 2016 out of a personal desire to really read more authors of color, and really specifically too, to make connections with other folks who were big readers who also wanted to read books by authors of color. Unfortunately, we're no longer meeting. We had been holding some Zoom meetings, but just lately with some increased personal responsibility, I did kind of have to step back, but wanted to talk a little bit about just that experience. When we had our first meeting in person in 2016, we had about 4 people. Our last meeting, we had about 15 people on Zoom. And it's just been really enriching to read a lot of authors of color, because I think in schools, especially in the US, public school, private school, you don't really read a lot of authors of color in the curriculum. And I was just really dissatisfied to see that when I was a high schooler, you know, we read some authors of color, but not as many as I would have liked. And then when I was a high school teacher myself, it seemed like it hadn't really changed. It sort of seems like if you're really wanting to read more widely and more diversely, that it's almost something you have to do yourself. I'm a big reader, I'm a big bookworm. I kind of get to know people through book clubs. And so when I had moved back to the area, I was attending a lot of meetup book clubs, but it seemed like the focus was still on white authors. So many of the participants and readers there were also white. And so me starting this book club was kind of a way for me to also read more widely, but also get to meet and connect with more readers of color as well. Let's see. So most of our focus, we did sort of read a lot of different types of authors, but also I wanted our focus to be specifically on Black authors as well, specifically Black women authors, but we did also read authors of other races and nationality. And for my book club, we kind of had both a wider variety of participants, I would say, in terms of racial makeup and background. We did have white participants, Black participants, Asian American participants, as well as folks who are Latinx. So kind of a broader range of folks wanting to read just authors of color and just having really great discussions. But we did find that having to have specific guidelines was really helpful too, to kind of keeping the discussion more focused and relevant. All right, so a little bit just about the necessity of collaboration. I know Reggie talked on this a bunch too, but I wholeheartedly agree that, you know, the Black community, the Asian American community, we all really need to work together in solidarity with our communities, because we're all working to end white supremacy, and that our struggles are really tied together. And for me, one thing that I echo is that I also kind of feel like I never really learned a lot about Asian American history in the US, especially political movements. More recently, I think last year, the PBS documentary Asian Americans was really eye-opening because there were a few names that I'd heard before, like Grace Lee Boggs, that sort of thing, but I hadn't really seen the full depth of the history of collaboration between Asian Americans, between Black Americans, as well as Asian Americans and other nationalities, and really seeing how Asian Americans, I think currently sort of have a stereotype of sort of being seen as apolitical in some senses. And so kind of seeing this history of Asian American activism kind of inspired me to see that, you know, this is in our history, this is in our community's background. We have worked together, we have collaborated with other communities of color and have made great change. And to also recognize that Asian Americans hold just a lot of debt to the African American civil rights movement. And so many of our current Asian American civil rights are so tied closely with the Black community as well. And then finally, just some barriers and opportunity. I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier too. So this idea of that stereotype as Asian Americans as being apolitical or not involved, kind of wanting to keep our heads down, which I think in some ways, some immigrants might sort of hold that mentality. I think me personally, I have heard certain comments from my parents about, you know, why are you going out to march? Why are you going to this event or that event? You know, just kind of keep your head down. And I think that that can be a dangerous mentality to have. I attended a virtual Asian American mental health virtual conference, and one of the speakers there said something that really struck out to me and really stood with me. About how certain Asian American immigrant communities can sort of have this, he called it like an anti-social mentality, where it's sort of like, we're going to keep to ourselves. We're not going to be in solidarity or be in communication with other communities of color. And he said, I'm using it as a very broad term in terms of we're isolating ourselves. We're kind of cutting ourselves off from that interaction with other communities of color. Kind of already spoke a little bit about that lack of knowledge of Asian American political history, not seeing that our struggles are really bound up together. And also there being this scarcity mindset. I think Yuri mentioned earlier about some of the divisions, like Asian Americans who are against affirmative action. Sometimes I think communities can have this mentality of a zero-sum game. You know, maybe we're all trying to get ahead when we know that, or push each other down when it's really, we all have a common enemy, and that's white supremacy. So remembering to kind of keep that in mind. And also I think the model minority myth is something that really needs to keep working on dispelling that myth, because I think knowing the history of where that comes from, how that happens, and also just reminders that, you know, there's all kinds of diversity within the Asian American community itself too. So great, thanks so much.
Yeah, Jessica, thank you. So our next panelist is, before I go into the next panelist, I thank you for a clarification from the person who asked the question. It is control. Yes, it is control. The next speaker is Ricky.
Hi everyone, can y'all hear me okay? Cool. Hi, my name is Ricky Leung. I use he, him pronouns. And as Yuri mentioned, I work for an organization called North Carolina Asian Americans Together, and one of the co-founders there. Currently, I'm the Senior Director of Programs. And a little bit backtrack about kind of my personal journey in activist space. I'm not sure I would consider myself an activist. I was born in Hong Kong and moved to North Carolina when I was 8 years old to Greensboro, and have been in North Carolina for the majority of my life. Went to school at UNC, and Jessica and I were actually classmates there. after I graduated, I went to Washington, D.C. to work for National Geographic and the Smithsonian Asian Pacific American Center. And I point that piece out particularly because echoing what Jessica and Reggie had mentioned of the lack of, education about Asian Americans in history. And really, and I would note that it's not just Asian Americans, right? It's like the histories of all BIPOC communities, Black history and Latina history and indigenous history that has been erased from K-12 education, and also in higher ed as well. So we see there's been pushback against ethnic studies. Um, I point that out because it's through my growing up in North Carolina, I saw myself as Asian and an American as separate identities, and didn't really see or understand what Asian American meant. And it wasn't until I worked at the Smithsonian that I really actually learned, because that was their specific mission, is to uplift Asian American history and presence, that I understood what that meant. And that kind of brought me to the path of knowledge, what that Jessica uplifted a little bit. The understanding that Asian American as a term actually came into being as a political identity in the 1960s, coined by Yuji Chioka, as part of I think part of that movement around the World Liberation Front, I believe, and also has its root and in Black-led movements as well. So that in itself is a very intrinsic tie into how our common liberations are wound up together. And so that and growing up in North Carolina and Greensboro in particular, I've always been really inspired by the civil rights movement as well. And so that kind of really for me gave me a sense and tied me a little bit more to the history of US and my belonging here, my identity as Asian American. And in that sense, and that is why I decided to come back to North Carolina and start an effort that eventually became NCAP, because I saw that there wasn't a pan-Asian political space for a movement that's also intersectional and working with alongside other communities of color, and really bringing that awareness to our communities, our very diverse Asian communities here in North Carolina, as Jessica has also uplifted. And so that I can segue a little bit that then into NCAT itself. So we were founded in 2016, and a lot of our beginnings have been focused on voter registration, voter education, really getting our communities buy-in into we do have a voice and we don't have to keep our heads down, so to speak, and also uplifting the education that there has been in history of folks like Grace Lee Boggs and Yuri, who has been in the forefront of civil rights movement, and that we do have our a legacy in that sense, and have a model to work from. Not to say that just because there's been people doing stuff in the past that we cannot do more. Obviously can always build relationships more, and I think it's that really intentional erasure of that history that is driving divisions among our communities, and I think that's intentional. And one of the things I point to is it's intentional even to the point of dividing communities within Asian communities. Jessica mentioned the model minority myth, which is detrimental for both Asian American communities within our own communities, and and where we are also seeing things like affirmative action, where we're pitting groups are being pitted against each other, and not knowing that it's detrimental to us all. And the biggest beneficiary of this is white supremacy, right? That structural oppression. And so we see also what inspires me also is there are intersectional movements also, like we see out of Charlotte with our friends over at SEAC. You know, we also, and I lift that up because that modern minority myth also the needs of the diverse Asian communities. Often centers when we think about Asian American, East Asians like myself, and not really like us looking at the needs of communities like Southeast Asian communities. Oh, SEAC is a Southeast Asian coalition. They actually now go by SEAC Village, and they work very intentionally with Southeast Asian communities, but they also work very closely with the Black community in Charlotte. And so they're a really great group and one of our close friends. Bringing back to NCAT also, you know, since our inception, because there hasn't been like an Asian American specific organization like Pan Asian statewide, that a lot of our learnings have also been in close steps with Black-led movements here in North Carolina and Latino-led movements. And so we also work in close coalitions with folks like Raleigh Pact that Jessica mentioned, and with groups like El Pueblo and Siembra, and knowing that like it's together that like our voices are stronger. And so there is definitely a need for that. And sometimes like one of the things I think we can do better in is like, because I'm in that space and like working with groups, that really one of the things that I personally could do better on is also bringing our community members with us who aren't, you know, day to day in that space. And so I see that as one of the role of NCAT is to provide that political education for Asian American communities, to uplift what Jessica and Reggie has uplifted, the needs for political education. One of the things, in addition to the model minority myth that I want to lift up, is perpetual foreigner myth. You know, Asian community members have been in the country since the 1700s. And there has been also intentional exclusion, right? Nearly 100 years of exclusion, like by law, of Asians from the United States. So there is also that specific piece of intentional exclusion and erasure from the history of the U.S. And from our movements. So sorry, I went over a little bit of time, so I want to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next panelist is Carl. You're muted, Carl.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be a part of this conversation. I really look forward to the discussion after our presentations. I'm Carl W. Kinney II. I am the spiritual leader of Liberation Stations, home of the Underground Church, and I'm also a freelance journalist who writes right now most with the Rev Elution, the blog that I created to look at the intersection of faith and community space. My work since moving to Durham, North Carolina in 1989 to attend Duke Divinity School has been examining ways to do praxis work. Praxis is just a real neat way of talking about how to bridge the gap between theory and actual praxis, the actual work in communities. And I've been grappling for a long time with ways to talk theologically that are deeply transformative. For me, that the work that we're doing here is part of an ongoing work on my part to engage in a different type of truth telling. That if we're going to do the work of changing communities, the way we think about what it means to be community, we need to do some truth telling, and that it impacts the way we talk individually as a person, the way we talk about our experience, and also what it means to be a community beyond the boxes that we create as a consequence of, we create these boxes, race being a social construction, for example, created to keep us divided. For me, these conversations, it's important that we frame them theologically, beyond whether or not a person is a part of a faith community. Talking theologically for me is an important way of looking at what it means to be created in the image of God. We call it imago Dei, what it means to be God created in the image of God. To me, that's very relevant in these conversations, because ultimately what we're talking about is what it means to be Black and created in God's image, what it means to be Asian American, created in God's image, what it means to be gay, created in God's image, what it means to be woman, created in God's image. All of that plays a part. And in many ways, when we come together and we have these discussions, we're able to talk about what it means to participate in transformative work as people who are created by God to do exactly that, to build a world that is more in line what it means for all of us to be created in the same way, in the image of something divine. So what we're ultimately doing here is engaging in the undoing of destructive language and practices that is based on these unruly ways of talking about race, and undoing the kind of social constructions that marginalize people. That's what kind of work we're doing here, and it's why I'm here right now. This is the difficult work that we need to do to get to a more meaningful place. For me, as I began processing this talk, it was important for me to begin in talking about our truth telling, to think about what we have in common as Black folk and Asian Americans. And when I think about Asian American, I'm very mindful of the fact that there are a lot of communities within the Asian community that come from different cultures and practices. It's broader than just being Asian American. There's Japanese, Taiwan, there's Philippine, there are all these different communities that legitimately need to be talked about in very different kind of ways. So this conversation for me is problematic in that we're beginning by a claim that it's all the same thing, and it's not. So I want to put that out there because I want to honor the different practices that are present in these conversations about Asian American. It's critical that we do that. The experiences and the histories are different. But with that said, I think there are some things that we can look at as in common that can begin to fuel a bigger conversation that can lead to unity. And the one is that I think that we are uniquely multi-generational, that we are a people, Black folk and the Asian people I know. When we talk about what it means to be community, we're very mindful that we are connected to our parents and grandparents. For people who are Black, we talk about the village of the saints, the mighty cloud of witnesses that are there, the ancestors that are there. We're connected to multiple generations and make us who we are. And I think it's important that we note that's something we do have in common. We take care of our elderly. We're concerned about our young people. We're concerned about how what we do impacts the future. There is a commitment not only to the legacy of the past, but there is this commitment to the future that I find is a commonality between Asian Americans and Black people. And with that being said, there is a sense of solidarity that takes place in Asian communities and also within Black communities that makes this conversation a difficult one, because we wanted to be sure we're taking care of ourselves. Black folk want to take care of themselves. They want to be sure that we're communities that are engaging in conversations that uplift the race. And Asian Americans in many ways are doing the same. They wanted to create a solidarity. And when you note that the third piece of that, the third point for me is that there is a sense of isolation as a consequence of that. When you go to a college campus and you'll find Black folk gathered together in one space, and you'll find Asian Americans gathered in another place, and people will look at that as in very critical ways. But ultimately what we're dealing with is we find the people who are like us so that we can build relationships to protect ourselves from whatever may be out there lurking in the air that can create tension. So that's a part of the common good that it's a common good that also leads to this level of separation between Asian Americans and Black. And I think we need to name that for what it is. But we also have this very, 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 we have in common a history of confronting white supremacy. So when you look at the histories of Asian Americans, be it Chinese Americans who come to America and connected to the railroad in the West and what it meant to develop culture there, or the Japanese who came to America, some prior to World War II, some after. You look at what happens in the internment camps in America with Japanese. There is a commonality in our overcoming white supremacy. And so that's something we need to look at that. But within all of that, there is also this commonality that we are identified in many ways by our ability to access white normativity. The closer you get to whiteness, the closer you are to success. And so we see that friction between Asian Americans and Black Americans, where it is perceived that Asian Americans are more adjacent to white than Black. And so there's this whole move that is a fight away to move away from Blackness. Asians are viewed as being more white adjacent. Blacks are seen to be the farthest removed from being close to white normativity. And with that comes a certain type of advantages that show up that create this tension between Black communities and Asian communities, where white Asians are seen as being closer to whiteness than Black people, and Black people are viewed to be more discriminated against as a consequence of their being further removed from whiteness, and all of this tension comes into play. There's some points that I'm gonna stop here, but there's some points that we may need to discuss when it comes to some of the barriers. I think that it is important that we name that the perception among many Black people is that Asians have access to white wealth as a consequence of being more adjacent to whiteness, that allows them to build businesses that are placed within Black communities. They're able to reap the benefit of Black wealth. They're able to gain wealth through Black clientele, where Black people are not able to do the same. And so there's that tension around this perception that Asians are closer to white, and therefore closer to white capital, and therefore closer to white privilege, and therefore closer to white benefit than Black people. And so there needs to be conversations about how to bridge those gaps and building relationships that look at equity, economic equity, and also ways of building a greater community. I'm gonna stop there. I said a mouthful, but I think there is space here for a real good conversation about the perceptions, misperceptions, and how we have this common bond around trying to overcome the limits of white supremacy.
Thank you. So at this point, we will begin to ask panelists some questions from moderators, as well as some of the questions that had been sent during the registration process. But I want to also acknowledge that Wendy Green, who was the co-organizer, and she's still participating this afternoon, but she had a family emergency. So Siobhan Stone had stepped up to be one of the co-moderators. I just wanted to acknowledge, because Wendy had done a lot of work bringing this group together as well. So, okay, so let's see. I think this is, so they say familiarity breeds contempt, but ignorance does too. How can each group gain a better understanding of the other? Because this is a question, but also I like to add to this that do you have like friendship with the people of the other groups? And does that even make any difference in this conversation? You know, do we need to know someone pretty personally at a deep level, or could it be actually a deterrent, right? So who would like to go first?
Well, so since I'm unmuted, I can begin. I would argue that any effort with the goal of building greater collaboration and understanding demands that we get to learn each other. You know, the work I do around my gay activism work could not exist unless I got to know some gay folk. You know, when you learn the stories of a person, and in Yuri, our relationship is an example of that, that my understanding of Japanese history and culture, and the struggles of being a Japanese, an Asian American, Japanese American, comes out of that relationship. So I think that any time we're talking about building a bridge, that is the work of praxis work. You're engaging with the people rather than allowing theory to control the way you conduct yourself in the work that we do. Is actually getting down and dirty with the people, getting to know them. You cannot work with poor people and guess you know poor people. If you do anything other than that, you're making the assumption that you bring greater to the table. We are not better than the poor that we serve. We're better than the people that are from whatever ground it may be. We have to build the kind of relationship that's able to see each other as the same, created in the image of God, or whatever you want to call it. The same stuff is within each of us. The intellect is in all of us. And then at that point only can we begin to build these bridges.
I agree. I agree. Can you hear me? Oh, okay. I couldn't tell. I agree with you wholeheartedly. We've got to get to know each other, or else I'll just always be, oh, you know, that's Reggie. She's that Black woman over there. Or, you know, that's, instead of saying, oh, yeah, that's Reggie, that's my friend, because that makes a difference, because then we can talk real open and honest. And I think for penetrating the Asian community, which again, you're covering a whole bunch of folks, is this might not be an easy thing, but it requires stick and stay. Beyonce says, you must not know about me. And that is true. We don't know. We don't know. So we go along with what mom and them said, or our own narratives and stuff we made up, you know, so, but to commit to say, let's get to know each other at any cost, instead of going in with what I got to say, what I got to share, and what do I have to lose by becoming friendship, you know, by beginning a friendship with them. It's like, hey, it's us. It can't be a them and us, a them, and it's got to be us, that we're in here together. And I think that's required. Do I have any Asian friends? Too, but we've gone beyond just knowing each other to we're friends, and we talk about real deal stuff. You know what I'm saying? And that, I mean, and it took a while because we decided that's what we wanted to be. And I think that's what's required for everybody in here. And I also think that it's going to be a difference with the older generation and the younger generation. You know what I'm saying? Because, hey, we even know about mom and them, and they might not even want to be talking to no Asian people, Asian American people. And as well as as other Asian American people may not want to be talking to us. But I think that younger generation is going to will help open that door, I do believe, and break down some of that stuff when they can talk to their own mothers and grandmothers, rather than here I'm up in here trying to say, talk to me, and they're looking at me sideways. You know what I'm saying? So yeah, I believe collaboration is possible. And I believe building relationships is possible. Might be hard, but it's possible.
Thank you so much. Our next question is, historically, there have been effective alliances. But
hold on. I think Ricky actually had a hands up, and then Jessica too. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. I just wanted to echo what Carl and Reggie both said about the friendship, and also to add to that it can also be a both and, in terms of we shouldn't stop at, you know, I have Black friends and then that's it. We have to go deeper, you know, building on those deep relationships to work together in movements. But also recognizing that, like, our friends, like, aren't the only representatives from, you know, those communities. So also, you know, doing those deep education for ourselves about our own community and other communities. And I say that because, you know, I recognize from, you know, within the Asian community, for example, there definitely is anti-Blackness. So if, you know, knowing some of those friends, they might not, you know, necessarily have like the same, like the broader context of how we can all work together, and, like, you know, yeah, I just wanted to bring that piece, uplift that piece as well as a both and.
Yeah, and I also sort of wanted to just echo what folks were saying about how I think personal friendships, personal relationships are really key. And another point I wanted to uplift too is that it's really not funny is not the right word to use, but it's very interesting to me how sometimes, or maybe more than sometimes in the US, just because of white supremacy and these long-standing historical consequences of segregation, how it's actually very difficult sometimes, I think, to create these personal relationships with people from outside of your, race or ethnic background. Because like I sort of touched on earlier, when I was moving back to the area, one of the ways I wanted to make friends was to go to these different meetups. And I almost had to, well, I did have to kind of create my own in order to find other friends of different nationalities and races, because I did want to kind of cultivate these friendships. And so there's almost this extra effort you have to go to find people of different backgrounds and races and really get to know them as people. Because I think that, having these book discussions, seeing things on the page, it's different too when you can discuss with people who are Black, who are Asian American, about our different life experiences. It just brings so much richness, I think, to have that interaction. And I agree with what Ricky was saying too, that, there's definitely things that, the Asian American community needs to do internally to kind of address anti-Black racism within the Asian American community, as well as some of the questions that Carl brought up about sometimes having that idea of success as being proximity or assimilation. And what does that mean when maybe some members of the Asian American community, maybe those who are East Asian, kind of do have a different set of opportunity or access to white wealth or wealth in different areas that are not accessible to the Black community? And what does that look like? And what are things that the Asian American community needs to do to address that and really be in solidarity with the Black community?
Thank you very much. So next question.
That was a perfect segue, actually, when we talk about the businesses in African-American communities. There is a question. Historically, there have been effective alliances, but now, to be honest, there are some resentments. Asians think African-Americans are taking their spots at top universities, and African-Americans resent racist behavior of some Asian vendors in the community. Do you have ideas about better ways to bridge the gap beyond the importance of building those friendships and getting to know each other? Do you have any additional ideas about bridging the gap? And is there a particular issue that you believe can be ripe to test this new feasibility of a better, more effective alliance?
Yeah, can I start with this one? I think we can begin by owning that one of the tools of white supremacy is to separate us based on stereotypes.
Yep.
Okay. So the separation based on stereotypes, where Asians are smarter, harder working. They're good at technology and math.
Yeah.
And Blacks are lazy. They're criminally minded.
Yeah.
And so we're separated by these stereotypes. Make it difficult for us to join together. And in addition to that, there is a sense that Asian Americans detest Black people, further in line with the deviant kind of behaviors that is connected to those stereotypes. I do think that we're at a greater place for some collaborative work. I think that what my message to white business owners is the same message I give Asian Americans. And that is, if you establish businesses in a predominantly Black community,
put your money in there.
In many ways, participating in gentrifying those communities.
Indeed.
You see this with the businesses that cater to Black women, the hair products. You have these businesses that take advantage of it. I think it's very important that if I'm talking to the white businesses, I'm talking to the Asian business, or whoever it may be, it could be whoever it may be, that if you're really taking advantage of the businesses in those communities, we need to have some collaboration with the Black communities, or you're coming into those communities and you're gaining from. There needs to be some kind of collaboration, conversation about how Black people are impacted by your business being in those communities where you're making money. I think that's one way we can do it. Is the conversation that has to begin from the Asian community down. I think it matters more that if that's a willing act among the Asians instead of Black people pressing the question, because it can come across as being intrusive. It can be seen as intruding upon their business model or whatever it may be. But there are these places, but I think it is important that Asian Americans recognize that part of the struggles with Black people is that greater proximity to whiteness, the advantage. And if we really want to talk about equity and inclusion and diversity and the building of a different kind of community, those are the conversations we really have to be about. Even when it comes to access to education, we were talking about affirmative action. We got to look at the history around racism or anti-Blackness, how discrimination shows up, Black people, Asian people, how the history plays out, and how access to education how that works out historically. That's what I would recommend.
Thank you so much. And I think Ricky had his hand raised as well.
I think I was a clap.
Oh, okay.
But I agree with everything that Carl said, and I think kind of referencing, like, I think there's a lot of like political education that needed to take place within the Asian American community. And when we talked about like the relationships between Asian business and Black community, there's definitely like historical precedents of like what we can look at, right? Like from the LA uprising of '92. There are definitely lessons from that to be learned about how Asian American communities can do better.
Thank you. I think Reggie.
Yeah, well, I think it's that distrust is a biggie. That distrust is a biggie on all sides. I mean, I walk into the Chinese restaurant to get my beef and broccoli, and I might get a smile. But most of the time I don't. It's like business, right? Of course, I go into the hair store and I get a smile because I'm in there kind of regular. You know what I'm saying? But it's like, but it's my being there is putting green in other people's pockets. So what are people doing for this immediate community? We're right here. We're right here. I mean, what are you doing right here? I mean, I go to the cleaners because that's the cleaners that's closest to me. But what is there any give back at all when we're right here in our communities? Just because you can buy a whole lot of businesses in Black communities, it's like, where is the give back? Where is the appreciation? Come on. You know what I'm saying? Where's the appreciation that this green money came out of those brown hands right there? You know what I'm saying? And I think that's the thing. People are looking at, and Lord have mercy, don't let me go in your store and you follow me around. I know you're not following me around in this store. And your store is in the community I live in. I mean, it's a whole lot of that right there, and that's why that is the barrier. Do you only look at me as a dollar bill? Is that the only way you look at us? And we become those people, I remember one of my friends told me she went in the hair store and got into this gigantic argument with this Asian woman who was telling her what her hair needed. And she's like, wait a minute, you can't tell me what yes, you do. And she said, would you believe that it is? But it's like, come on. If you can make your money on me, can you do something else for me in this community you're in? What I mean, that's just common sense, folks. You know what I'm saying? And so, and that is where a lot of the problem lies, I do believe. It's right there. You're right here in my face. And then you don't, I mean, you got to put you got all these barriers that we can't even get past. And I think that's what a lot of people feel. But, I'm going to the Chinese restaurant on my way home. But anyway,
yeah.
I mean, that's just real.
I just want to piggyback on what Ricky said. The LA uprisings of 1992 are a good example.
Perfect.
having been in Ferguson after the death of Michael Brown, same kind of thing where you saw the massive looting.
Mm-hmm.
The primary victims of the looting were businesses owned by Asian Americans and white folks and Arab Americans.
Mm-hmm.
So it was so there's a need for a conversation. We talk about the looting, Dr. King talked about it's a language of the hurt,
Exactly.
there is that, but I think there is a need to press deeper into the psychology of looting related to people who are able to come into Black communities and build while those who are in those communities can't access that same power. I think that there's a beginning of a deep
That's something.
that may be where we need to start.
Right there.
All of these conversations start right then. Why people are enraged so much so that when something happens, that's the first place you go. So
That's real.
And I think that kind of, I'm sorry, did you have
Go ahead. Yep.
I was just going to say, I think that does really go hand in hand with what Ricky and folks are also talking about in terms of just education too, political education. I think there are some Asian Americans who do kind of buy into the model minority myth and have that idea of, these stereotypes of like, oh, Asians are working hard, but don't know that history of, highly selected, only really highly educated Asians being able to immigrate to this country. So already kind of starting from this more privileged economic and educational space. And I think too, when we're talking about just kind of this economic, Asian businesses kind of, earning their money from the Black community, but not really giving back. I think there needs to be more conversation too from the Asian American community or folks in general, just about reparations and about, economic payments and just the history of Black America and what's really needed, and just talking about this economic divide and, that we're not kind of fighting each other, but again, like how can we uplift both communities and also really point to, what the Black community really needs as well.
Indeed.
Thank you all so much. Trust, the Black dollar, the psychology of looting, you hit on a lot of things. And so I'm going to turn it back over to Yuri. There was, I think, a question that she had. And I think Ms. Botts, you posed a question as well, but we'll get to you shortly.
Yeah. So the next question I have is, Ricky, you mentioned perpetual foreigner. Jessica may have also mentioned the perpetual foreigner stereotype of Asian people of all generations, really, starting from, in fact, 1500, I think. In America, can the panelists speak to the responsibility that Black American communities and leaders have in deconstructing the harmful stereotype? This is coming from an Asian American participant.
Thanks for that question. I cannot speak for what the responsibilities of Black communities are in this situation. I can speak to how we can educate ourselves and provide the context of I think this speaks to racial triangulation a little bit. So there is this axis of there's and this affects a little bit not just Asian American communities but also Latino communities as well. There's axis of the spectrum of privilege where we talk about white and Black, and then there's also nativeness and foreignness. So where Asian Americans, our position is not necessarily just along the axis of white and Black, but also kind of a little bit over to the side a little bit. And because that for the, I guess the concept of perpetual foreigner also introduces some barriers to access and as well. So I don't know. I think it is more just providing education to our communities to understand that a little bit more, for ourselves to understand our position of privilege among a myriad of axes, actually, gender and and all of that. socioeconomic status, as Jessica has mentioned. Like there are among the immigrant community, there's folks who are also refugees who come post 1965 as well, who are invisibilized by the minority myth as well. Kind of bumbling through my answer a little bit,
Yeah.
so maybe Jessica, if you have any pointers as well.
But I think the question was actually raised to African American panelists. So I appreciate your clarifying what you were talking about. I mean, I know it's a big thing in the Asian American community.
So can I address it a bit?
Yeah.
Are we good? Okay. I want to preface by saying that when I posted on Facebook after the horrific violence in Asia, the hashtag against Asian hate, I received a number of responses from Black folk that were opposed to my posting that. And it was problematic for a number of reasons, but it did expose what I believe is this response to the movement, this multicultural movement that has offended a lot of Black people. And it's a movement that I think is really about perception. And this is this competition for the label of the oppressed people. It's like competition. We're more oppressed than you, and therefore shut the hell up. And so there's that kind of nuancing that's taking place right now, where I had this conversation this last night with a Black person who was fighting my LGBTQ activism work, with this idea that we're becoming so multicultural in the way we talk about these issues that Black concerns are being put on the back burner. So I think it's important that we think different about what it means to be community.
Yeah.
What it means to be community beyond our different labels, the label of gender or race, whatever it may, orientation or culture, whatever the box may be that you identify. I think it's important that we think about the broader ideal of what the world should be. And for Black people, I think it's important that we take ownership of the need to let go of being the like head of the class when it comes to oppression. And I mean, consequence of the fact that the only thing we got as a people is oppression. And we Black people in America, the only thing we can say, yeah, we're the best at is being the people of oppression, that our oppression is worse than everybody else. Don't take that away from us. So, I mean, there's that kind of psychology at play too. So I do think that Black people, we need to say that we're gonna align ourselves with more than just the Black stuff. And building a community that is different. And I do think that's what our work has to be.
And sorry, and can I jump in with one quick thing also?
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Sorry, I misunderstood the original question. I thought it was for me because I heard my name.
No, that's okay. And that was my interpretation. Maybe it was for Black panelists. But I think what you have said really added to the conversation. Yeah.
I did have one last thing I wanted to add to what Carl said, is that I do think that Black communities throughout history has shown up for Asian communities like a lot. And I just wanted to uplift that, like from Frederick Douglass, who has can't come out against the Chinese exclusion policies as well. So, and as I mentioned, like even the political identity of Asian American would not exist if not for Black-led movements. So just wanted to uplift that as well.
Yeah. Okay. Reggie?
Yeah, in thinking about community, Carl, and this was a picture somebody painted for me yesterday. They said if it was your grandmother walking down the street and someone of a different hue punched her out, and people of a different hue were standing looking at it, how would you feel? And that thing hit me like a ton of
Yeah.
bricks. Like, man, you know what I'm saying? Because that could have been my grandmother or yours or your mother. You know what I'm saying? I mean, instead of saying it's just us and our stuff and our oppression, what if, because it could be, come on. What if that was your grandmother that was walking out of the grocery store and she got punched out, and the people also coming out of the store just looked at it? How would that break your heart? You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's that. You gotta look differently, because for us, it could have been. Come on, somebody. It could have been at any given time. So that's the thing that makes you look.
Right.
You know, it makes you look at this whole thing like it, not just us. It could be anybody, anyone. So where's your heart for it? You know, and that moves that thing from saying just us, don't talk about nobody else. We know what our situations are. It's still I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, that is what gives you a wider view. And I think that's what you were saying, Carl. Yeah, it does.
I know. I mean, we could talk about this for days. I'm sure that there are other questions. So, Siobhan, would you like to lift up another one?
Yes, there was a question about the impact of striking different cultures, having an impact on working together as one common goal, like representing my whole group sort of thing. And I think the panelists said, to clarify, Chinese versus Japanese versus Korean versus Indian versus Nepalese, not necessarily versus Black culture, but could include as we're now talking about. I think the diversity within the Asian.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, when we talk about solidarity, that is important point to point out, like within Asian American communities, because there's this has turned into an umbrella term that like really like as Jessica and Carl has also mentioned, has erased a lot of the needs of for example, when we sometimes the term folks in the community would use as AAPI, was Asian American Pacific Islander, and sometimes the use of that term is just so ubiquitous that we actually invisibilize the specific needs of Pacific Islanders. So for NCAT, like for our work, because we don't have specific program to address needs of the very specific needs of Pacific Islanders, we actually don't use AAPI in our work. We use Asian Americans unless we do on occasion like specific outreach to Pacific Islanders or include like information that address their needs. Then we use the term API. That's a side note. But your point is this is a good question, because like part of NCAT's mission is to create a space for cross-ethnic solidarity as well. One of the things that like I am personally heading is a community partners network where we are tapping into the cultural groups within the area and connecting them. So like there's a Nepalese community group, a Vietnamese Chinese community group, and a Sikh community group that we kind of brought together for the first time, that like they're really working in a political movement sense to activate our communities to work towards the common goal. And so I think that's definitely very important, in contrast to something that's happened in history as well. In Hawaii, for example, the sugar plantation owners there explicitly imported labor from different ethnic groups and kept them segregated intentionally, and playing on their division so that there wouldn't be a collective like labor movement in other parts of the country. So I just kind of like want to again like kind of looking back at those like root causes of intentional ways to divide our communities, not against, like not just across races, but also like within ethnic community groups as well, and not just for Asian communities, but also for Latino communities and Black communities as well.
Yeah, I think it's kind of a fine balance to kind of walk where, because, you know, I do think that folks do have a lot of really great pride in terms of their specific Asian American community. And so sometimes you'll talk to folks, or I'll talk to folks who might not necessarily identify as Asian American because they do think that that term is too broad. And so sometimes it's about those conversations about saying what that means, Asian American, as a political term, and what that means to kind of have that solidarity, as Ricky mentioned, across ethnic lines, and what that can really accomplish. Because I think sometimes folks aren't aware of the possibility of what that might mean to say, you know, I'm so-and-so, I identify as Chinese American, but also on a broader, more pan-Asian or Asian American, that I also identify as Asian American. And that's what this means. You know, that's what it means to kind of have that solidarity across different Asian American communities. So I think that can be powerful, but that's something that, you know, sometimes folks need a little bit of unpacking to really see why that term can be so important as a political possibility, I think.
Thank you. I'd like to move to the next question, which again, probably necessitate more answers from Asian American panelists, but Carl and Reggie, if you have that personal experience or opinion, please jump in. Is it still the Asian American sentiment today the same as it was years ago, 60s, for example, that Blacks are uneducated, lazy, and someone to be feared? If so, why? Is this still told to Asians today the same as it was yesteryear? I feel like I'm jumping in to say something, but then I would just pass to the panelists.
I think you should.
Should I?
Yeah.
There are, in fact, so I come from Japan, so there are anti-Blackness in Japan. And so people from Japan bring those here. And I have heard some things. So this is second or third hand, but there was a Japanese family coming to this area for temporary, a couple years. And this wife asked my friend, Japanese American, if there was a school that has no Black people, no Black teachers, no Black students. All right, so then my first reaction was, well, how would she think that her kids can get into those schools? But so there's this kind of very, I mean, that's, I hope, I mean, I know this is really painful for particularly Black folks in this attendance to hear this, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that these things happen. And I mean, that's why keep telling stories and having communities is very important. So it's not just in this country, but then out there, it's there.
And I also think that if I can, I think the media feeds a whole lot of that. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, even the news that I'm trying to trust will still bring a slant. And it's like, oh, those terrible, terrible Black people. And I'm like, it's terrible people everywhere. Come on. You know what I'm saying? I mean, but yeah, I think the media feeds a lot of that. That, oh, we're so fearful. Oh, those people, they're so terrible. Like, who told you that? And where did you get that? And do you know anybody that you can talk to? Do you know anybody? Do you have friends anywhere? Do you have friends who have friends who have friends? I mean, I guess it gets fed into people and they just accept that. Like, this is it. So we need to be scared of those people because they are savages. Really? You know, and I think that's where a lot of that comes. And people just accept it like, yeah, that's how they are. Or you read the newspaper and two kids in school get arrested for something. One comes out with handcuffs. That's the black kid. One comes out when his mom just takes him home, and the police will never come. You know, it's just that crazy stuff. But if it's put before you, what's that little joke? It says, "Oh, I believe it. It was on the internet." It's like, really? So, you know, we have to look at, but what's feeding a lot of that, which is doing exactly what white supremacy wants to do. It keeps the division. It keeps the fear and the ignorance alive and well. And so I think we know the source. We know the source of that.
Yeah, I would agree with what Reggie is saying, and also what Carl said earlier too about stereotypes, how these
Too many
ignorant and just not true stereotypes just kind of stay in the ether, whether it's also perpetuated by the media or just what things that people say. And so I think there is that really important responsibility for folks of all races, when you hear stereotypes of someone, or of an entire race, to really speak up and say, that's not true. That's not true. You can't characterize a whole group of people like this. Or why do you believe this? Where is this idea coming from? To really kind of dig down into that stereotype and the roots, and to really try to kind of continue that conversation to debunk those stereotypes. And I think, like Reggie was saying, this is why the earlier conversation we were having about connection and personal relationships and friendship are so important, because, maybe if I didn't grow up with friends of different races, or if I didn't have friends of different races now, maybe I would buy into those stereotypes because I hear it so often, perpetuated everywhere. But because, I have friends that I can point to and say, I know so-and-so, I know that they're not like this. I know that, we've got friends of different nationalities and races, and that what's being said is not true. And so it's kind of this constant effort, I think, to almost remind yourself that, you hear these things, you see these stereotypical or just flat out racist things that pop up again and again. And we have to remember to keep pushing against it, that constant battle to kind of decolonize, or, really push for those anti-racist perspectives constantly, because we know that white supremacy is always trying to
keep the division.
Exactly. Always try to keep the division. Yep.
Yeah, and I'll echo what everyone else has said already, like, particularly around the master narrative that really reinforces white supremacy, and how important it is for us to, really recognize, like, for Asian community in particular, like, that anti-Blackness exists in our communities and has existed. And I'm encouraged by, like, our younger generation, folks even younger than myself, who have, like, spearheaded a lot of, like, the conversations around anti-Blackness with their family members, with our family members, and really, like, recognizing that issue in order for us to really, like, address it and find solutions to it. And one of those things is really making sure that we're uplifting Black voices, uplifting Asian voices in our stories to combat, and Latino stories and Indigenous stories to combat that mass narratives, to tell, like, have our communities tell our own stories and take control of that, rather than having the media and the master narrative tell our stories for us. And one of the things that I'll uplift that NCAT is doing, one little bit of something that we're doing is, last year we started a program, and we're about to launch it again, is an Insight Stories program, where we're investing in storytellers from Black communities, from Indigenous communities, Latino communities, and Asian communities to work together, providing political education and a space to tell our community stories. So I'm really excited about that, and hope that we can grow that as a model, to not just to build space and bridges among our communities, but also to amplify our stories, to challenge that master narrative.
Add just something that could be helpful too, is to maybe point to history as an example, to kind of think about, what are some of those cartoons, depictions, or those stereotypes of, Chinese folks when they kind of first immigrated to the US, and, with the whole yellow peril, sort of those different stereotypes, and how how that can be just another example of just how untrue stereotypes can be and how they can also change over time.
Thank you. I just am going to say, Dr. Seuss, if you look, he had cartoons about both of us, some things, and yeah. But Siobhan, would you like to lift up another question?
Yes, so it's almost 4:20, so this will be our last question to discuss, and then each panelist will have 1 or 2 minutes to share your final thoughts, okay? What are sustainable ways for our communities to bring our families together? Sustainable ways for our communities to bring our families together.
I think one of the greatest models for building community is not in these large collective spaces like church, you know, but it's at the dinner table.
I agree.
I think, you know, a great model is just to find somebody and come together and eat, you know, and share your story. Find an Asian family and just sit there and get to know each other to continue that process. I think that's how we can do it.
Yeah, I agree. I think food can be such a good bonding experience. And I think in the same way that kind of sharing our cultural treasures or just cultural traditions, just going along the same lines of food in terms of music, holidays, just a lot of celebrations, and just kind of sharing that cultural history, I think can be so important. You know, like, this is what I love about being Chinese American. You know, tell me what you love about your culture. You know, what about Black history, Black traditions, food, music is really meaningful to you. So I agree that just kind of bonding over food and these kind of cultural touchstones can just be really affirming and fun and delicious too. Exactly.
I was literally going to say the same thing about food because Jessica and I were actually talking about potlucks earlier. I love food, love like really talking to people over food as well. And really any food. I love cooking. The other piece I wanted to also uplift is also recognizing like some folks that might have been disconnected from their culture, also recognizing that. So like, you know, also be sensitive when we are like bonding over food to not expect, you know, someone because they're Chinese to bring Chinese food, for example, because they might have been an adoptee and not know anything about Chinese food. So just also want to uplift that piece.
Thank you for uplifting that, Ricky.
I also want to say that, Jessica, what you're doing with a book club, you know, that's really a great way to bring people together too. But I also want to lift up what you said in your presentation as, you know, focusing the conversation. And being in the Reggie's supper club, I also know, you know, you can eat and have friendship, but then remain in the surface. But Reggie always throw in some monkey wrench and said, "You all read this thing and then talk about it," or you know, you go and do the training somewhere, and I mean, so it really also requires beyond that, right? Now, I mean, we might have 7 minutes for people, so I guess I'm sorry for those of you who submitted the questions and we didn't have time to answer, but I really appreciated all of you to be here today. This is an important conversation, and I hope this is a start, or maybe for some of you it's an ongoing conversation, and we need to really keep this going. So each panelist, you have a minute or two to just say your last word.
Well, if I can jump right in.
Say? Yeah.
If I can jump in and try to be brief. I bringing groups together over a covered dish meal, which is pre-COVID, but bringing people together to talk through stuff is the only way I know to do it. You know, you can't do it in big groups because people can hide in big groups and nod and act like they're with it. But it's small groups and small gatherings where we can get really down to the nitty gritty and talk about what my real fears are and what I really don't like and what I really don't understand and that I really need you to clarify. I mean, and I advocate gathering in small groups. Now, I am looking for another forum just like this. I mean, I'm ready to host a forum just like this, where we can come together and we need to keep talking. We didn't even get to the surface. We got to keep talking about this stuff, you know? So I'm interested in sponsoring something where we can all come back again and hear, listen, ask questions for understanding, not to fight and be arguing and we've done enough of it. But I'm talking about to be able to really talk through and say, let's get to the root of the matter. Talk to me about you. Talk to me about y'all. Talk to me about why y'all feel this way. I think it's so needful because that's where it's found like you find out like, dang, I didn't even know it was like that. You know what I'm saying? I came to the table with my mess and it was all wrong, right? So I advocate, let's do more of this, you know, and I hope people are open to having another forum just like this, you know, where we can just come together and talk about it because that's the only way we're going to get there. I said I was going to be brief, so I'll stop now.
Amen.
You know, I can go.
Yeah. Jessica, you want to go next?
Sure. I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended, as well as all the panelists. I feel like we touched on a lot of good things, but again, like Reggie was saying, it's kind of a good starting point and the conversation needs to continue. And I think it's just really great to have opportunities like this to really talk about, you know, what can we do to kind of work on this distrust between communities? How can we form closer relationships and true connections where we can really get to that nitty gritty and talk about, you know, stereotypes or talk about this warped idea of success as this proximity to whiteness. You know, what can we talk about? What does solidarity actually look like? What does it mean to really expand what we think and who we really call our own? And how do we show up for one another? And what does that look like? So really appreciate the conversation we had today.
Ricky, do you want to go next?
Sure. I don't really have a ton to add to what Jessica and Reggie have already said. They've put everything so beautifully, and I look forward to future potlucks or cover dishes post-COVID with everyone. Maybe you would have a karaoke set up right after. I love karaoke.
Love that.
We're volunteering you.
Carl?
Yeah. I'm sitting here and thinking about programming ideas. And there's a documentary on Netflix called Men, The Fight for America. I watched it, and immediately after watching, I think it's the second or the third, I can't remember, there's like six of them, six-part series that dealt with the Fifth Amendment and how it impacts Asian America. I recommend, because it's an incredible history lesson around the Asian American fight for inclusion and this thing we call America. And with that, I just want to finally say that I'm really thirsty to know more about Asian history and cultures.
Me too.
And I really want to know the interconnections that we are missing out of because our textbooks don't talk about it. And I'm enamored right now with the study I've been doing on the connection between the Philippines and Black America and how the Philippines fought for Black folk in this country. I mean, they're very powerful stories that have not been told. But more than anything, I'm really thirsty for a greater understanding and appreciation for the different cultures that are Asian that are part of this country. So I commend you for this conversation. I pray that we can continue the process and moving us closer to each other. I'm thankful that we were able to be honest with each other. The level of transparency is an example of what it means to get to the next place. So thank you all for this opportunity.
Cool.
We did. Thank you all so much. We did have a question from a panelist about connecting with you all, with your organizations. Is it possible that you will be able to share your information in the chat box to everyone, our panelists. And then Carl, was it the name of the series, The Fight for America on Netflix?
It's called Amend. It's Amend, The Fight for America. It's hosted by Will Smith.
Okay, Amend, The Fight for.
It really, really great stuff.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Yuri. Thank you all so much.
Well, I really have nothing to say and probably have less than a minute left, but it's been amazing. I really appreciate the panelists, and thank you so much for the questions from the attendees. You know, maybe when we continue this conversation, wherever it might happen, maybe we can address those questions, and I'm sure there will be more questions. So it's 4:30. Thank you so much for being here, everybody. Now the meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.